Hi, I'm Stephen Berkeley, Director of Global Business at Flint Rock Consulting. For over 25 years, I've been working with values and how they influence our lives. In this Our Insight series on working with values, I bring you conversations on values with thought leaders from around the world. Let's dive in for our conversation. Welcome to another interview in our series of Working with Values, and it's my great pleasure to welcome to the show Stela Lupushore. Welcome to the show, Stella.
Thrilled to be here, Stephen. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, and it's your background is so interesting, and Stella is the Chief Reframer at Reframe Work Inc. What a great title. Is also the co-author of two books, Humans at Work and Humanizing Human Capital. She's also the adjunct at NYU, New York University School of Professional Studies, and she teaches digital workplace design and design thinking. Stella is passionate about improving the workplace and the workforce experience and making the world of work for everyone. So welcome again. And the first question that we love to ask our guests on the show is, what are values?
So when we think about values, it's the official definition, right, is the capacity of a good service activity to satisfy a need or provide a benefit to a person or a legal entity. And this is the business definition of value. When it comes to our human values, right? These are the guidelines, the rules, the worldview, the frameworks, and shortcuts, mental shortcuts that we create in order to evaluate the reality around us and make better decisions that align with the principles by which we live. And many times, I think in the context of the business, we define value predominantly from monetary implications, right? If you can ascribe a dollar value to it, then it has value. Everything else that it's intangible may not necessarily be considered as valuable or investable. So the challenge was looking at the values through the lens of a CFO or a shareholder, is that it makes for great decisions where you have measurable things, right? You have an accounting system, you have a financial system, a supply chain system, and you track the movement of that value that gets created or moved from one department to another. When it comes to intangible values, it's really difficult to quantify and measure the impact, and therefore may not be treated as important aspects of running an organization, may not be invested in. So think about employee well-being, right? It was not something that was easily measurable, and therefore not necessarily a top priority for the organizations until it became a business continuity problem and companies couldn't operate without having their employees be functional, productive, stress-free, and able to perform. Learning investments, investments in the workplace experience. A lot of these things are quite nebulous and unstructured and unquantified yet, and therefore not as prioritized. And at the end of the day, it impacts our life at work, and especially as more and more of us define our identity through the work we do and the activities we perform in the work environment. It's an important aspect of us because we may bring a lot of the negative aspects of work to home, into our life, in our relationships, in how we show up in general in the world. So value, it's in the eye of the beholder. And therefore it requires a tailoring from the workplace perspective, right? What's important to me at this stage of my life, given my experience and trajectory, may be very different than your values and what you expect from the work environment. or what may be important for somebody who just enters their work experience, or somebody who is on their way out and leaves and transitions out of the labor pool. So the more nuanced and personalized we can consider the set of values that guide us, the easier will be for us to personalize that experience at work. There's another aspect when you think about the shareholder and stakeholder conversations, right? There is a emergence of stakeholder capitalism, and a lot more organizations are using some of those principles to guide their internal decisions and looking holistically at the impact and value they create for all stakeholders, not just shareholder value. And those are the companies that care about their employees and invest in the employees' well-being and program and access to opportunities. These are the companies that care about their consumers and customers because they believe in the longevity of the relationship with the consumers. They're also caring about the community because that may, on a positive side, drive employment. They may drive economic development. On the flip side, it may drive pollution and higher traffic. So the more holistic you can think about the end-to-end value creation chain as an organization, and then think about all the stakeholders involved or impacted in that creation, and then creating a business model that allows all of those stakeholders to gain value out of the association with the company, as opposed to prioritizing ones versus the others. Those are the companies that are emerging as leaders because they capture the soul, the mind, and the wallets of all of us.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack there, and there's quite a bit that I'm going to come back to. What I'm really curious about is, can you tell us of a time where, or a story that was a pivot for you in how you think about this whole end-to-end value chain? Was there any penny drop moment, or was it gradual? What was that pivot that helped you think differently about values?
It was an organization, a former employer, that was quite an interesting model and working on very technically advanced capabilities and coming up with some very interesting technologies. At the same time, it had the perception of a workforce that was staying way too long past their shelf life employed by the company, and there was a concerted effort to replenish and resupply with digitally savvy and at the core younger, at the core cheaper labor force. And I was in the HR at that time, not part of some of the specific efforts, but being really keenly aware of a lot of the decisions that were being made, that at the core of it, they were ageist. They were negatively impacting people who either worked a lot longer for the company, who inevitably would be older in their life stage. And having observed hundreds of people who were not only let go and they lost their income temporarily until they found something else, but also seeing the pain that this brought to them as individuals, because they believed in what they did, they believed they brought value, they believed they were great performers, and then they were treated as disposable widgets in this whole organizational machinery. And to me, it was a moment where I realized how we don't think about the worker journey from end to end
Mm.
and life cycle, and not just think about what it's like to be while you work here, but also what happens before you join and your impression about the company and decision whether you want to come and work there, as well as what happens when you leave and after you leave, because all of those are part of the same story and circle. If you don't treat people well on their way out, a lot of that will end up in the public, will possibly come to bite you as a lawsuit. It would possibly impact somebody's decision whether or not they want to come and work for you, even though they're young and cheap and hungry to do the work. So there is no start and end of the relationship from employment perspective. It is just a continuous cycle, and it begins way before the worker decides to come and join the organization, because there's a point of discovery, there's a point of interest that gets built, that I want to come work there. There's a point where you say, okay, I'm actually going to apply and stop going through the recruitment. There's a point where you get the offer or you don't, and how you're made feel in that process leaves lasting impact and leaves little moments that matter, that in cumulative in totality will shape how you experience the company after you join, if you decide to join, or even after you leave, and what you're going to tell your friends, your family, whether you're going to continue to stay a shareholder if you had share from the company, or you will decide to come back as a contractor. So organizations don't think that way. They just primarily think from a job process lens and from the hire to fire or hire to retire, as opposed to thinking about the journey from a worker perspective and what it's like to be that worker while you're interacting and building that relationship with the company.
So there's a lot at stake for organizations, and what I'm seeing is that you've brought a very empathetic lens to that. And again, I'm curious about what are the challenges that you face when you're working with organizations to for them to come to terms with this empathetic lens and the value of it.
I think a lot of times organizations think that empathy is something that it's counter to the business mindset, because if you're being empathetic, therefore you're not going to make good business decisions, as opposed to saying, look, there are small decisions you can make that shows your empathy without compromising the business results. And you can do that along the entire journey. My favorite example is comparing and contrasting how the technical layoffs were happening late last year, or they started last year, and contrasting how Twitter handled the workforce reduction in a very chaotic and not communicating, and sending an email overnight telling people that they're not to show up tomorrow, which resulted in deep cuts and deep emotional cuts in the workforce, compared to Stripe that had to conduct the same layoffs, but there was a leader who stood up and said, I made the wrong decision. We overhired. This is the reason why we have to do this. And here's what's going to happen to all of you who are impacted. You're going to, if you have immigration status, here's how we're going to deal with your immigration situation. Here's how we're going to deal with your severance. So there's a very clear communication about the impact, but also showing empathy and having ownership and taking ownership and accountability for the need to make such decisions. I bet those who were let go from Stripe will feel very differently about Stripe as a company for a long time.
Yes.
And it's showing up that empathy in a way that can resonate to people. It's not providing the consulting speak or something that really obscure, that legal approved, but at the same time it does not represent the reality or it kind of doesn't treat people with dignity because you don't believe that they're adults and they can understand what's going on.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said, that you're taking small steps around empathy, and that you can be empathetic without it adversely affecting the business. And you spoke about earlier about when people become aware that there's a business continuity problem, and I think you're speaking specifically about well-being. And so how do you gently bring that shift of the connection between understanding the employee or the worker's experience and how that impacts on business continuity?
You quantify it. You bring it back to the data, because once you start speaking through the lens of business impact, you are standing on a very different principles and facts that the business leaders can really relate to. So let's think about attrition, right? We have seen significant movement between companies. We have seen a lot of people just completely leaving the labor market or taking a longer pause without having another job. And it's a lot of movement, right? Certain industries are laying off people, and finally the companies previously who couldn't afford some of this highly sought after technical talent are now finally able to find them. It is a lot of movement. When you think about a person leaving, most of the time companies quantify it as a cost of attrition, right? So they will say, well, we're just going to look at the replacement cost, and for more junior roles, probably it's about a rate of one annual salary replacement. That is the replacement cost for somebody who leaves. For more senior one, it can get to up to 8 times their annual salary. But that's just a small part of the story, because if you think about people's productivity from finance perspective, you would think, well, somebody left and I saved 6 months worth of salary because it took me 6 months to replace them, as opposed to saying there were 6 months worth of productivity that didn't get done. Those are projects, those are business connections, business development, those are clients that weren't satisfied, those are whatever business objectives that weren't met. So while you might have saved half a year worth of salary, you lost significant amount of revenue that can be easily quantified, and justification in retention can be made. And you say, look, do you want to lose 10%, or do you want to allocate 10% and invest in their compensation or retention, or do you want to lose 3 times more of that amount just because somebody is not going to be in that spot to fulfill the commitment that they were allocated to fulfill? And then when you take it as a company at a larger scales, that adds up very quickly to a big amount. And if you don't have people to do the work, there's no company to operate at the end of the day. So the more companies can think longer term and bring that empathy, bring that kind of intangible, pay attention to the intangibles, the more likely they will build that workforce who's gonna stay and going to perform and be loyal and deliver on the promise to the customers as they are expected to do. Because people don't want to jump. They're not going to jump for the sake of jumping it for marginal cost, right? Maybe if there's a significant difference in the compensation, they may jump. But at the end of the day, they want to stay. You just need to give them a reason and not make it miserable place for them to be. Because if a lot more people are going to leave, you're not only have to worry about replacing them and replacing the productivity loss, but also worry about those who have to pick up the slack in the process too. So it's the survival syndrome as well that will have a play as well to you.
I hear what you're saying, that organizations, I guess, needing to increase their bench strength around analytics and developing their capabilities. But one particular capability that you are honing in on is paying attention to the intangibles.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about that? Because the employee value experience, as you said, is it's a life cycle. There's no start and there's no end. How does an organisation pay attention to those intangibles, whether it be related to the before, during, and after, but also particularly during, and the different stages of the employee's career or the different parts of the employee experience? How do you stay in touch with the intangibles?
So let's start first with the complexity of value proposition that enterprises have to deal with, right? It's represented through the different frameworks and different collection and assembly of values that companies think that they are delivering as part of their value proposition, employment value proposition. I describe it in the Humans at Work book through a pyramid of employment values. And at the core, it has fundamental things like working for a company that provides fair pay and remuneration for the work that people do, that provides safe working conditions, that provides accessible work environment, that complies with law and it's ethical in its decision making, right? Certain things that are kind of baseline, everybody has to deliver on, and everybody expects to see when they come work somewhere. But then the more you go up the pyramid, the more complex it gets, right? Some people want to build their skills. Some people want to build their network and community. They want to build products they feel proud of. They want to have access to benefits and well-being. They want to attain that status or whatever the title that they want to get to. Some people want to leave a legacy or have a company or work for a company that has a bigger mission in the world and provides positive social impact. You just cannot address as an organization all of this, right? It's impossible to deliver on all of it, nor should every company deliver on the opportunity to attain self-transcendence, right? It's a choice, and it's a deliberate choice every organization can make, and saying, what is it that we want to be known for? It can be as simple as this is the place that becomes your launch pad for any future career opportunities. We prepare you for your next job, whether it's here or elsewhere. And based on that values, if you make that choice, then you can say, all right, let's look at all the processes, all the programs, everything that we offer to these people. Will we be able to deliver on that commitment, even though it's just one? And then if you do, and you make deliberate decisions on changing the environment and experience such that people can feel that this is the place where it's a launch pad for whatever the next job is for them, then you will attract people who are interested in that. You will retain people who are interested in that. And on top of that, you'll prepare the workforce for tomorrow. Because the world is shifting, and the more you can prepare the workforce for whatever is next, the better the organization will be itself. But we don't typically think of value proposition. Most of the time, we just say, these are the benefits you're going to get, right? We'll pay you fairly based on the market rate. And then everything else is, the access to benefits. You're going to get parental leave, number of vacation times. So it's a very classical list of offerings that occasionally you may add, some yoga classes or some discounts to certain experiences, but it's usually very consistent, and it's around the one size fits all buckets of offerings that may not always be inclusive, right? So if you think about parental leave in a way that's not an inclusive program, because I may not be a parent, or I may be too old to take advantage of it, but I have grandchildren, or I have caregiving responsibilities that I may take advantage of that leave, but I would not qualify if it was just parental. So I think the opportunities for companies is to really think about who are they trying to attract and what is it important to them given different life stages, and how can you make your offerings to be inclusive regardless of age, gender, life stage you're at, etc.
Yeah, there's I guess a key theme for that is around the particular interventions is around inclusive.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering though, that what we've been talking about so far is in terms of an approach and principles and analytics. What role does conversation have in this? And what skills do leaders need to develop to really understand? Because you said you can't meet everybody's different stages in that pyramid. But what are the level of conversations that leaders need to be having, and what role does conversation have in this?
Significant, because many times we assume and make decisions for all sorts of reasons, be that it's a legacy kind of process and practice, and we leave it alone and don't want to change, or for cost excuses that we don't want to pay any extra for anything new, as opposed to saying, what is it that is critical for you? What does matter for you? What would make you be your best and do your best? And most of those conversations need to happen at the team level, because that's where decisions about workload, about schedules and flexibility happens. You may have a program that gives kind of the framework for the whole organization, but the work happens day in and day out in the trenches, so to speak, on the ground with your teammates, with your manager. So the more conversations can happen within the team and transparency, the better individual contributors or individuals in general will be able to negotiate and trade off certain things that would make them operate better. So yes, maybe the organization does not allow for a 4-day work week. But if there is an agreement that I will work all the hours necessary that are 5 days worth of work, but I'll work them in 4 hours, so I have a compressed work week, that's manager's discretion that can allow and provide this individual flexibility they need. Maybe they need to take care of their aging parents, and that requires more time, more personal time to focus, or maybe they have certain treatments that they need to go to, and that requires extra time for them. So it's all about explaining the needs that you may have. And obviously, when we think about empathy, we always say, well, they have to have empathy for us. But I think empathy is a two-way conversation. Mm-hmm. And on one side, a worker may have demands and needs, but they also have to understand and have empathy for the manager who has to deliver on whatever commitments they have to deliver on, and figure out a way that is a trade-off on both sides and can accomplish the goals on both sides without significant diminishing the needs on both sides as well.
But what do you think? I'm going to put you on the spot here in terms of you've witnessed a whole heap of organisations going through this transition, helping them understand this life cycle. What are the top 5 skills? May not be top 5, but that leaders need in changing the way they view the employee experience, and helping bring this type of culture into reality, because we're just talking about conversations, but there's conversations and there's conversations. And that the whole aspect of empathy. What are those skills that a leader needs to inculcate and develop and refine in order to bring this to a reality?
So when we think about skills, because it's skills, but also attitudes that have to be at play.
Skill set, mindset, tool set, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So you have to be good at managing a distributed and diverse workforce with diverse needs. And this requires some humility. This requires giving up on the control and empowering people to do what they need to do and trust that they can do it. The other aspect of it is really good goal setting and the ability to articulate what needs to get done by when and how, because the vagueness and inability to articulate what needs to get done may also lead to misunderstanding of the workload and how it gets distributed. Distributed team management, that's another important skill, and that is a very different skill set than managing by walking around the office, because you're no longer able to see who does what, and it's not about presenteeism, but it's again about that trust and clear communication so that people who are expected to do something know what they're supposed to do by when and how. And also the ability to coach, because it's not necessarily manager and directing, but it's helping people do their work and find the expertise and skills and confidence in themselves, because there's nobody else there to push you or inspire you. And then I think the most important part is really be the true authentic self. I think we've so been conditioned to play the corporate kind of persona and hide behind the very politically correct, everything under control, everything is being managed, as opposed to saying, yes, my life, it's a mess too. I also have children running around and need to care for, make dinner or pick somebody else from school, or I completely forgot about alcohol. So being more human and more authentic and present, I think, will also go a long way to build that sense of inclusion and kind of trust with the team members.
Wow, that 5 stars. And the things that I picked up was around the humility, because you've got distributed workforce with diverse needs, and it takes a lot of humility to understand that. Good at goal setting, and being able to articulate at what needs to be done. Because you're working the distributed team management, a great deal of trust and clear communication skills. Number 4 was around coaching, and that ability to coach people rather than, directing everything, and empowering them. And the last one was about authentic self. Yeah, it's a pretty good recipe right there.
Now, tell me how many managers would agree with that.
Yeah. That I mean, that's a whole game in itself in terms of how you bring people on the journey to that type of thinking, and that's why this series exists, is to expand thinking around it, and we want to have conversations that are not being had elsewhere. And I think this is an important conversation to be having. I'm wondering, you've talked about the various stages of the ecosystem and understanding the before the journey, during the journey, and after the journey. But you've also talked about the future. And how does an organization keep their eye on the ball with respect to the changing needs of their workforce, with respect to the priorities that people have in terms of their values? I'm a busy organization. I'm busy focused on my getting things to happen and do, and now you're asking me to keep my eye on the future as well. How do we make this possible for organizations? What are the simple steps?
It's very simple. It's creating a listening strategy. So you include your employees within the feedback loop. And it doesn't have to be exceptionally complex. It can be a weekly poll about what's top of mind, what are the trends you're seeing. So in essence, you're crowd ideating, you're collecting and you're tapping into the collective intelligence of your workforce to understand the trends that are happening or that are driving the organization forward, as well as the opportunities for the company to improve. And it's not about the traditional employee engagement surveys, right? Yes, those are interesting and important, but it's about the acting on it that is lacking. Many times we're good at asking, but not doing anything with those results. Whereas thinking about the listening strategy as a way to give input into the organizational strategies and understand the sentiment of the workforce around certain topics and make them really easy and quick will give you a really easy access to the pulse of the organization. And I can give you an example from one of my past. One of the past employers, we built a sentiment analysis tool. So it was hundreds of thousands of employees who were chatting on the internal social network. We built a tool that was ingesting all the content from that chatter, all the publicly available, so it's not anything password protected. And then we could detect topics. Do people talk about something that the CEO recently launched? Are they talking in positive terms or negative terms? Do we see how the negativity spreads? Is there opportunity for somebody to go intervene locally and find out what's going on? Because when you have a large scale, large distributed workforce, it's really difficult to have visibility to all of that. But technology now enables us to do it organically and in a passive way. And then once you understand that something is going on, then you say, all right, now we can go do a deep dive, maybe around a focus group, maybe around a countrywide or location-wide meeting to understand and get to the bottom of what's happening and then figure out how we can solve. So that's one, is just asking people and getting the listening part. The other part is empowering people to do something about it. So the more we can distribute the power and lower the center of gravity and not assume that the center and the headquarter knows everything, because especially when you have multiple operations in multiple countries, when you have multiple locations to deal, multiple cultures, the economic environment, the political environment is very different. And the more people on the ground can make decisions that are related to the day-to-day activities, as opposed to having the need for the decision to go all the way up, all the way down, and by the time it comes down, it's too late. You will enable that agility, but also you'll give them a sense of autonomy over their activities. And when people feel that that's encouraged, I think magic happens, because they may take things in their hands and solve a lot of problems otherwise could cost you, a lot of money, time, and clients and heartache.
Yeah, and we need more magic. Yeah. So like a simple strategy around have a listening strategy. And whatever that is, you'll find something or some way in which you can listen in. But it's not enough just to ask questions, but you have to have enable and acting, and to do that, distributing the power. Yeah, great. Thank you. What I hear you talking about in our conversation is very much, I guess, a new way of leading, and a preferred way of leading. But when we go into some organisations that may have a historical background and there's management principles and practices that seem to be embedded, and often without any evidence in the first place, and they're holding true, what can we do to be aware of those unuseful principles and practices, and how can we sort of mix the balance there and disrupt that in a way in which we can have new ways of thinking and new ways of leading?
I think HR has as much of an opportunity to contribute to this conversation as the business leaders themselves. I think it's a helpful exercise every year to look at all the HR programs that are in place and start assessing what's effective, what's no longer effective, and what needs to be just tweaked to make an improvement. And most of the time when HR wants to do something, they just pile on top of existing one. So then you have to retrofit the existing to adapt to some new practices and communicate and have a content team develop content and communication strategy, change management, etc. As opposed to saying, what should we get rid of, right? That's to begin the first conversation. Like, what should we clean up? And this is no longer serving just because it doesn't have the right type of impact or it doesn't deliver on the outcomes. And measurements come back into the play again, right? We don't necessarily evaluate the program effectiveness through the lens of the business impact that we're having as a result of it. Because at the core, it has to be about impact on the business. So if you want to invest in leadership development, is there a relationship between the program you put in place and the actual business results? And if you've been running this program for the past several years, you should know that answer and then make adjustments as necessary. Number two, I think many times we create such big, complex structures to support those processes in order to attain whatever the original goal was, that it's really difficult to eliminate it or change, because everything is designed to preserve, right? If we think about any program that we put in place, it's like a system, right? It will strive for self-preservation because there are systems in place, there are people who are managing those processes, there are measurements that are put in place to evaluate the performance of those people. Everything is set up to reinforce that system and preserve it. So the important part is to look at some of these rewards and aims and motivators that will keep this system in place, and think about how those need to change first. Because if we set up an organizational goal that you need to have EPS score attained, or EPS price, that earning per share, that's one measure of evaluating your leadership performance. And then you have ways to develop that capability that then brings the type of language, the type of processes, the type of support structure from HR perspective that keeps that alive. By the time you, by changing just one HR program is not going to change the overall system that is on top of it. So HR need to think holistically and systemically, and also think about, back to your point, where the world is going, and will this structure support us in the long term, or will it become bigger and bigger that eventually will crush the organizational ability to be competitive. There is one book that left a long impact on me. It's by Margaret Mead, and it's called Who Do We Choose to Be? And it goes through kind of the cyclical approach to civilizations that also can relate to companies, right? There are several generations. You have at the beginning revolutionaries who have big vision of changing the world, who then over time get more comfortable. The system becomes bigger and more unable to bear its own weight until it crashes at the end. And from organizational perspective, it's similar type of cycles that we need to pay attention and think about the trajectory of the company development. But more importantly, the point she had was the world is really complex, and technologies has accelerated the spread of information or misinformation. It created a very fast-paced, changing environment. It's really, really difficult to make huge systemic changes. what we need to start with is think about islands of silence, sanity. That's what she calls. So if you think about you and your team that you manage, or maybe you and your department that you have control over and oversight, and if you can make some changes within the department to make life easier, better, whatever, to relieve the tension or improve the people's ability to perform, the more of these islands can be formed, the more likely that then they can merge and can create a movement. So it's not a top-down change, but it's a bottom-up. But you also need to have a system that allows for some of the flexibility and allows for adaptation of the overall bigger system.
I like it. It's what a good friend of ours here at Flint Rock Consulting, Victor Purton, he's the Chief Optimism Officer for the Centre of Optimism, based here in Melbourne, Australia. And he works a lot around unlocking optimism. And I like that islands of sanity as that way of, you know, taking it a bit holistically and systematically. You can't change the whole system, but what are the bits that you can change? So I've got a question for you around, which is, you know, you've got your own life that you lead, you've got family, you've got lots of dynamics, and often the world can be a little bit unsettling, the rate of change that we have and the events that are happening in the world. What, amidst all of that, personally, what keeps you inspired to do the work that you do?
It is, my children are my teachers. They teach me every day about what the world of work looks like and will continue to be. And I really have big hope for us as a humanity, for the positive change. I'm really optimistic because I see their values and their principles and their expectations. And no, they're not, spoiled younger generation Z with no attention and no focus and materialistic mindset. I think there are a lot of stereotypes that we put in place on the younger generations, and they're absolutely not, at least everyone who I'm interacting with are not that. So to me, everything that I do is in service of them, because the work that I do, I see it as a way of impacting the work environment for them. And that definitely gives a very different perspective and a longer lasting motivation to not give up and continue to persist.
Yeah, lovely. I love that. That whole thing of you're in service of children, all children who are going to be inheriting our workplaces that we're working in the future. It's been a fascinating conversation today, Stela. I really appreciate the work that you've done on yourself and your own research that has enabled you to contribute the knowledge and the wisdom that you do. So thank you for all that you do. And
thank you so much, Stephen.
If you were to give one piece of advice to an up-and-coming somebody who's wanting to change their workplaces, wanting to change their culture and their team, they're wanting it to be more value-centric, what's your one piece of advice for them in taking one step forward?
I'll phrase it in a form of a question that a friend of mine asked me, and I use that as a filter for pretty much every tough decision that I have to make. And the question is, what's enough? I think many times we think we will change the world and nobody listens to us and we're so ahead of our time and it's so frustrating, and it really impacts our optimism, as opposed to looking at the world as a progress, right? What's enough to make me feel that I left an impact and I made a contribution to whatever the body of work that I thought was important to me? And what's enough for today, right? Maybe the rest can be done tomorrow or day after tomorrow. And what's enough And do I understand what's enough for whoever I'm trying to solve for? Because my perception of what people need may be different than what the reality is. So it's asking yourself, asking people around you, and whoever you're trying to change, what's enough?
Wow, powerful way to end this interview on working with values. Once again, Stella, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Owl Insights, Working with Values. Please do subscribe to our Owl newsletter and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. More information about today's speaker can be found in the show notes.